Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 diary entry, and in yesterday's segment we covered the Kornilov uprising that Dmitri was writing about. So you can read, if you want additional information, you can read about that online or watch the previous video, although I'm not an expert on it. So he was talking about this failed march on Petrograd by Lavr Kornilov, the supreme commander of the Russian military at that time. And it's not clear exactly whether it was an attempt to overthrow the provisional government and establish a military dictatorship, or whether it was an attempt to liberate Petrograd from the Bolsheviks. But Kerensky was at that time the prime minister. He and Kornilov had been allies. They both wanted the war to continue. And so, yeah, it was a disastrous thing for all concerned. And Dmitri he admired both men, so he was kind of, what could he say? All right, so that's the recap. Today we have a topic that I find very interesting. Could be a little sensitive, so I hope it won't offend anyone, but that kind of comes with the territory sometimes, I guess. It's Dmitri's perspective on his countrymen, on the Russian people. All right, here we go. It's strange to think that Russia is a republic, and it will be stranger still if the republic manages to last. I am firmly convinced that the Russian people will neither understand nor appreciate a republican form of government. We have not reached that point yet! Exclamation point. The Russian needs a single individual to follow, and that's understandable because independent opinions and politics go together with culture and the development of the mind and intellect. Nothing illustrates that theory more brilliantly than the fact that Kerensky has become just such an individual, drawing others along behind him. The Russian responds to admonishment with extraordinary ease and speed, especially if he is given inducements. He, as a man at a low level of development, cannot offer any reasonable criticism of what is said to him authoritatively by those whose whole will is directed exclusively toward persuading their unfortunately underdeveloped listeners! Exclamation point. That, in my opinion, explains the ease with which our army began to disintegrate. The theory that the army should be completely apolitical is brilliantly confirmed by our revolution. This especially applies to our Russian army. 75% of our troops are illiterate, and it goes without saying that they believe and obey whatever is told them by the man who, for whatever reason, temporarily enjoys their confidence. Without comparison, there can be no criticism. Without the ability to read and take a sensible view of things, without keenness of observation, there can be no comparison, all the more so for the illiterate man. Unfortunately, the words of the old regime, that only iron will and power can keep the Russian people in order, have also been justified. Actual freedom has led us to anarchy, and now we see the provisional government resorting to the methods of the old regime, methods that once provoked such a storm of indignation. We have returned to censorship. It's even been introduced in Petrograd and Moscow as a preliminary measure. White patches have begun appearing in the newspapers, just like in the good old days, and terms like political reliability, to cite one example, have also begun to turn up! Exclamation point. But, of course, that particular phrase means the opposite of what it did under the old order, and the censorship of telegrams, letters, even, it is said, telephone conversations surpasses that of the year 1916. It will be interesting to see what I end up having to write in this book over the next 2 months. It would be a huge mistake to think that our great revolution, as it is now called, and the salvation of which Kerensky and co. are so intent upon, forgetting about Mother Russia, has either ended or reached a point where there is nowhere else for it to go. I am firmly convinced that it is just getting started, and the end is still far off. Much blood remains to be shed before our state falls into the rhythm of a tranquil and constructive life. At the moment, we are undeniably going backwards. It will take much blood to bring this process to a halt, and even more to move forward! ! But my conviction that the Lord God does not want our homeland to perish is so great and firm that although I take a sober view of the future, I do so with peace of mind. Well, let us hope that that was true, although I don't think it actually was, about the peace of mind that is. All right, it's impressive, isn't it, the way he writes? Very thoughtfully. He doesn't grapple with the full complexity of things. For instance, that maybe one of the reasons the army began to disintegrate is because people were fed up with fighting. They just wanted to go home. A very, apolitical reason. But anyway, so the Republic, yes, a Russian Republic had been declared. And it seems to have been, as Dmitri said in the previous video, a response to the Kornilov uprising. What the provisional government existed for was to bring about, to be there in the interim until a constituent assembly could be gathered, voters all over the empire coming together and deciding for themselves, the Russian people deciding for themselves what kind of government they wanted. And so they wanted that to happen before they declared any kind of government other than a provisional one. But because of the Kornilov uprising and how precarious everything was, the provisional government did declare that Russia was now a republic and had an official government, although, they still wanted this constituent assembly. So that's what Dmitri is responding to. And, the idea, well, can this country that was until lately an autocracy with a legislative body that was treated as more or less just, an annoyance by the Tsar, could it survive as a republic? It will be stranger still if the republic manages to last, Dmitri writes. And then that's his starting point for talking about the Russian people. And, what he's talking about is that the country, as I've mentioned several times, was about 93-94% peasant at that time. And so, or uneducated people, if you count in the proletariat with that. So what do you do with a population like that? Of course they're going to respond to whoever seems to be in charge and charismatic, and we see that all over the world, including here nowadays. And that's true. When you have an uneducated population who are judging things on other criteria than, grappling with complexity, that's what you're going to get. So if the Bolsheviks hadn't intervened, could the Russian Republic have survived? Maybe. I don't know if he's right about that or not. He does say we haven't reached that point yet, so he's not saying that he's absolutely opposed to it. He just doesn't think it's going to work. And one of the problems is that when Peter the Great brought about his incredible reforms in Russia and formed the Russian Empire, he reformed just about everything except the peasantry. He decided to just leave that in its current state. Back then in the first quarter of the 18th century, there would be no modernization of the peasantry. they would be left in an ignorant state. And at that time, they were serfs, by and large. And so two things that weren't reformed in a timely way in Russia were the state of the peasantry and the autocracy. Alexander II wanted to reform the autocracy and to form a constitutional monarchy, but that was ended violently with his assassination. Okay, so I don't want to go off on a tangent here. But, then zeroing in on the army, Dmitri presents this figure of 75% illiteracy. So, he knows what's going on. He's very well-informed, and he's taken it upon himself to be well-informed. And so, I do respect what he has to say from his own perspective. He believes that the army should be apolitical. I think most countries in the world would agree with that. And then this interesting idea of, if you want to avoid demagogues and that sort of thing, then you have to be able to compare. You have to be able to make comparisons. You have to be able to grapple with complexity. But you can't do that. You can't be critical if you don't sort of have any solid foundation for that. So without the ability to read, take a sensible view of things, without keenness of observation, you can't make those comparisons. So quite right, of course. So this irony then of the provisional government being forced to starting out as a liberal government and full of, constitutional Democrats and even someone like Kerensky with a socialist revolutionary background, well, they immediately find out that they have to take, in order to hold things together against this growing threat of the Bolsheviks, they have to take some measures that originally they'd criticized the old regime, the Tsarist government, for. So all this censorship and redaction of newspapers and all this sort of thing. And, my impression is, reading between the lines, I could be wrong, is that Dmitri, did disapprove of those things in the old regime, and that, he considers them necessary, obviously, but that he wanted that not to be the case, that he wanted Russia to move beyond that with a more educated population. You wouldn't need those sorts of things. And then, this very correct assumption of his, I'm not saying that he was a brilliant prognosticator. I mean, the writing was on the wall, right? That the Bolsheviks were right on the edge of taking over, and indeed they would take over in the October Revolution, and the provisional government would simply be swept away. And again, what he's talking about with the population being uninformed, well, the main thing, as I understand it, that the Bolsheviks would do to achieve the initial success that they needed was to promise the peasants that they could have all the land. That was the one, more than any sort of sense of nationhood or patriotism, that was what this population had wanted. They always wanted the land. They always resented, and rightfully so, having to just have little strips of their own land, often of low quality, and then being forced to work the vast and rich tracts of land of the landowners. They wanted that land. That's understandable. The Bolsheviks, of course, did not give it to them. They merely promised to give it to them. Anyway, so interesting stuff. Dmitri takes a sober view. He's at peace. He believes that God doesn't want Russia to perish. And he thinks that the revolution isn't over, that it's going to keep going, that much blood will be shed. He's right. Technically, it wouldn't be over until 1922, which is when the Soviet Union was declared, if I remember correctly. And then you would have a stable government. I'm not saying a good one, but you would have a stable government that was entering into diplomatic relations and trade agreements with other governments. Okay, so we've gone from sort of looking at the vast or the big picture of Kerensky and Kornilov to narrowing things down a little bit more with, well, not really narrowing things, but zooming in on the Russian people themselves. And now we're going to zoom in further, and Dmitri is going to talk about his own personal situation and his relatives, his father and his sister especially, and talk about his sister's marriage and the reservations, the ways that he thinks it's a good thing and the ways he thinks it's a bad thing. So, yeah, that's what we have next time. I hope you'll come back, and I'll see you then. Bye.